Snow fell in slow, exhausted spirals over what once was a place of precision and death. The gates of Auschwitz stood half-buried beneath ash and silence. It was January of 1945, and the war was cracking open its final secret. The smell of burned fabric and disinfectant still lingered, even after the Soviets had crossed the Vistula. In that frozen chaos, an American doctor moved among the shadows, not as a liberator, but as a ghost who had already seen too much. His name was Dr. Leonard Harris, a physician from Boston who had joined the OSS under the cover of a Red Cross liaison. Officially, he was there to document the humanitarian crisis. Unofficially, he carried a hidden Leica camera and a notebook sealed with wax, the beginning of what would become the most disturbing medical record ever recovered from the ashes of the Reich. Dr. Harris had arrived months earlier, disguised as a Swiss physician assigned to inspect German sanitary conditions in occupied Poland. His accent was clean, his papers immaculate. No one suspected that the tall, quiet man with wire-rimmed glasses was American. He wore the armband of the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology, one of the institutions that had justified the most obscene of human experiments. His entry point was a small annex near Auschwitz, where Nazi physicians tested hypothermia resistance on Polish and Soviet prisoners. What he witnessed there, and later recorded, would not reach the US archives until decades later, long after most of those involved had vanished. The camp itself was no longer the machine it once was. Supplies were low, morale was collapsing, and whispers of the approaching Allies infected the ranks like a fever. Yet the cruelty had become almost mechanical. Experiments continued even as the buildings froze and the guards deserted their posts. Harris described in his notes a final phase, a period when the doctors of Auschwitz became desperate to justify their existence. They invented new procedures, new tortures, not for science, but for the illusion of control. And it was in that desperation that Harris found his purpose. He would infiltrate, observe, and record every horror before it was erased by fire. The diary that survived begins with a simple line: "I entered the place where medicine forgot its soul." Through a mixture of clinical detachment and trembling horror, Harris documented the first week, the sound of boots echoing in tiled corridors, the endless hiss of sterilization lamps, the piles of syringes labeled only by numbers, T7, Z9, R29. Each stood for a series of procedures. The prisoners, reduced to digits, were injected, dissected, or submerged. Some died quietly, others screamed until their throats bled. Harris noted how each experiment was catalogued meticulously, as if cruelty itself demanded precision. Every night, he retreated to a small storage room under Block 10 and wrote with a stub of a pencil, hiding his notes inside the hollow of a medical crate. His mission, though authorized by the OSS, had no backup. If discovered, he would be executed as a spy. But something beyond duty drove him. Perhaps guilt, perhaps fascination. In one passage, he confessed, "I am both doctor and witness. Every incision feels like a question that medicine can never answer." Outside the camp, Europe was collapsing. The Red Army was pushing westward. Berlin trembled under the sound of artillery. But inside the fences, time moved differently. The prisoners sensed the end, yet the doctors continued their routines with an almost religious calm. Harris observed how they avoided looking at the faces of their victims, speaking instead in the language of measurements: temperature, pressure, survival time. Numbers had replaced morality. He soon learned of a hidden wing within the infirmary, a sealed section known only as Laborom 6. It was there that 29 methods were tested between November 1944 and January 1945. The records of those sessions were destroyed by the SS before their retreat, but Harris's notes and photographs remained. What he captured, he would later call the anatomy of absolute obedience. On the third week, he began to smuggle small pieces of evidence: scalpels with traces of tissue, fragments of burned reports, a vial labeled Nervenversuch, Type B. Each item carried a story, each line in his notebook an act of resistance. He wrote by candlelight, his hands trembling as distant gunfire echoed beyond the walls. The final entry of January 1945 reads, "They are leaving. The doctors burn everything. The stench of paper and flesh is one and the same. If I do not survive, whoever finds this must know there were 29 ways to kill a soul without ending its heartbeat. When the Soviets finally arrived, they found the camp deserted and smoldering. Among the ruins of the infirmary, buried beneath collapsed shelves, lay a small metal box sealed with wax. Inside, 47 pages of notes, a roll of undeveloped film, and a half-burned Red Cross ID bearing the name Leonard Harris. The rest of his body was never found. For decades, those documents remained classified within American archives, dismissed as inconclusive intelligence. Only in 1987 did a researcher from Yale rediscover them under the label Operation Stillwater, Confidential. What emerged was more than a testimony. It was a mirror into the darkest anatomy of the human mind. And so begins the story of the American doctor who infiltrated hell and wrote down its language before it disappeared. The winter of 1945 devoured sound itself. Inside the barbed silence of Auschwitz, the snow muted everything except the whisper of machines still running long after their purpose had expired. Dr. Leonard Harris began to notice a pattern, a rhythm beneath the monotony of torture. Every 3 nights, between the hours of 2 and 4, a light flickered beneath the floor of Labor Arm 6. He had memorized the layout of the infirmary by then: 2 corridors, 4 wards, and 1 stairwell that led to the underground chamber where the true experiments occurred. It was said that only Dr. Ernst Brenner, one of the Reich's most decorated surgeons, possessed the key. But Harris saw him less and less. The man who once strutted in his immaculate coat now moved like a marionette whose strings were fraying, eyes hollow, jaw trembling, as if haunted by his own reflection in the glass jars that lined the laboratory shelves. Harris wrote in his hidden journal that the disturbance began not with screams but with silence. Prisoners were vanishing from the infirmary lists, entire serial numbers erased overnight. He realized that Brenner and a handful of assistants were moving the dying into the basement for final evaluation. The phrase sounded clinical, bureaucratic, but beneath it, Harris suspected a desperate effort to preserve something terrible before the camp fell. One evening he followed them from a distance, hiding behind the thick curtain of steam that poured from the heating pipes. He saw a stretcher carried into the lower chamber, and upon it a body that was still breathing, the chest moving weakly under a sheet. When the door closed, the muffled sound of metal instruments began. Days later, Harris entered the chamber alone. The floor was damp, the walls lined with frost and rust. He discovered cages, small, human-sized, reinforced with steel bars. Inside one lay a form that no longer resembled a man. The subject's limbs were swollen, the skin discolored by chemicals. Tubes ran from his veins into jars filled with clear liquid that glowed faintly under lamplight. The air smelled of ammonia and rot. On the table beside him were fragments of labels written in meticulous German handwriting. Experiment Nanya 18, sensory isolation, duration 63 hours. The body had been kept alive far beyond what was possible. Harris recorded it all with his Leica, each photograph an accusation carved into light. But the more he observed, the more the camp itself seemed to observe him. Guards lingered near the infirmary longer than usual. The nurses, silent, hollow-eyed women transferred from Ravensbrück, stopped speaking when he entered. Even the prisoners looked at him differently, as if they sensed that he was both witness and ghost. One of them, a Jewish orderly named Marek Weiss, whispered to him during a rare moment of solitude. "They are testing the border between life and death. They want to know how long a body can remember pain." Harris never saw Weiss again. His name was struck from the daily work list the following morning. Sleep became impossible. Harris began to hear the low hum of machines long after they were shut down, the echo of metal trays clattering somewhere beyond the wall. He wondered if it was imagination or the residue of the suffering around him. He wrote, "The air itself seems infected with memory. I breathe, and I feel their lungs within mine." It was during one of these sleepless nights that he found the first film canister hidden inside a vent, unmarked, unprocessed, containing frames of blurred figures strapped to chairs. Someone else inside the laboratory had been documenting, perhaps another physician consumed by guilt. The discovery terrified him more than anything he had seen. It meant there were others recording the same truth. But for what purpose? Confession or celebration? He could not tell. Outside, the war was collapsing into chaos. The sound of artillery grew nearer each day, the sky over Poland flickering with distant fire. Yet inside Auschwitz, order persisted with ritualistic precision. The daily roll calls continued, the injections were prepared, the charts updated. The doctors spoke less about research and more about legacy. They believed that Germany's defeat would not end their work. It would merely scatter it across the world. Harris overheard Brenner telling another officer, "History belongs to those who write it first." Those words would burn in his memory until the end. In February, Harris found himself called unexpectedly to assist in a demonstration for an SS colonel. The subject was a young Russian prisoner, barely 20, with frostbitten hands and a steady gaze. The procedure was to test neural responses during hypothermic trauma. Harris was forced to stand beside Brenner as the temperature in the tank dropped degree by degree. The prisoner did not scream. He simply stared at Harris, lips blue, as if asking him to remember. When the heart monitor flattened, Brenner dictated calmly, "Response ended at 12 minutes 48 seconds. Then he turned to Harris and asked, "Doctor, would you have done differently?" Harris could not answer. His silence was his signature. That night, he destroyed one of his own film rolls in the furnace. He could not bear to look at what he had captured. But even as the negatives curled into ash, he began another entry in his notebook. "Every image I burn becomes part of me. The light they lose, I inherit." The disturbance had become internal now, a war within his conscience. The line between observer and accomplice dissolved. By March, rumors spread that the SS planned to evacuate the camp. Brenner and his assistants began to pack crates labeled medical archives. Harris volunteered to help, knowing it was his only chance to uncover the missing pages. Inside one crate, beneath a layer of syringes and surgical gloves, he found a ledger bound in human skin. The title was embossed faintly, Verfahren zur Bewahrung des Willens, Methods for the Preservation of Will. It listed 29 numbered procedures, each described in cryptic shorthand. Sleep deprivation via auditory inversion, skeletal compression, induced maternal delirium. Harris copied as much as he could before the guards returned. The next morning, he was summoned to Brenner's office. The surgeon sat behind his desk smoking a thin cigarette, the smell of ether lingering in the room. He gestured to a chair. "You are not who you say you are," Brenner said quietly. His tone was not angry, but almost weary. "Do not worry, Dr. Harris, or whatever your name is. You will leave with us. You've seen too much to be left behind." The words froze the blood in Harris's veins. Whether Brenner intended to save him or control him, he could not know. That evening he wrote his final entry before the evacuation. "They know, but they also need me. Perhaps that is my only protection now. The experiments continue, though the Reich is dying. Whatever is left will be carried west, hidden behind new flags. I have no nation anymore, only the evidence." Outside, the snow began to melt, revealing mud streaked with ash and bone. Inside, the generators roared one last time. Somewhere beneath his feet, in the cold gut of Laboram 6, the flickering light returned. The disturbance had become a pulse, a heartbeat that refused to die, echoing beneath the ruins of medicine, reason, and faith. By the end of March 1945, the snow had melted into rivers of grey water that cut through the mud and bones of Auschwitz. Like veins still trying to pulse after death, the Red Army was days away. The SS officers were burning documents in barrels, yet beneath the collapsing order, the true machinery of horror had only begun to expose itself. Dr. Leonard Harris wrote that, "The closer the Reich comes to dying, the deeper it digs into the soul of science." It was in those final days that he saw the unrecorded procedures, the ones no official ledger dared to mention. Laboram 6 had become a mausoleum of light and metal. The walls sweated from the constant heat of the generators, the smell of ozone mixed with the copper tang of blood. On one table lay a man whose spine had been opened and wired to electrodes. The current made his limbs convulse in silent rhythm, like a puppet directed by an invisible orchestra. Brenner called it neurological retention testing. an attempt to measure whether the nervous system could remember obedience after the mind had gone. Another subject, a woman from Krakow, was strapped to a vertical stretcher, her eyes forced open by clamps, while gas was released slowly into the chamber. Harris saw her reflection in the glass and wrote, "She looked as if she was staring at me through the future." Each morning the experiments grew more frantic, as if the doctors feared that history would end before they could finish. They injected prisoners with mixtures of phenol and adrenaline, measuring how long the heart could fight against the poison. They submerged bodies in ice water until the pupils froze. They opened the skulls of twins to compare brain responses under pain. Brenner no longer dictated notes. He spoke as though possessed, whispering that they were extracting the last secrets of creation before God closes the file. Harris filmed everything with trembling hands. He hid the reels inside canisters of medical alcohol, labeling them as disinfectant. The camera became both shield and curse. Through its lens, he could pretend he was only observing, not existing. But the images stayed burned behind his eyelids, the slow turn of a wheel grinding bone, the hiss of ether escaping from a cracked tube, the faint hum of a prisoner's lullaby before silence took over. The horror escalated when Brenner introduced what he called Procedure R29, the final of the 29 experiments. It aimed to induce reanimation. The subject was a man who had been declared clinically dead after electrocution. Harris watched as Brenner injected him with a compound derived from adrenal tissue, then manually compressed the chest while shouting for current. For a moment, nothing. Then the eyes opened. The body arched violently, a guttural sound escaping from a throat that should have been silent. Brenner smiled, an expression of triumph twisted by madness. The patient's pulse lasted 43 seconds before fading again. "We have seen the door," Brenner said. "Now we must learn to walk through it." That night Harris tried to escape. He reached the outer barracks where the prisoners were gathering scraps of clothing, preparing for evacuation. But before he could slip beyond the fence, a guard stopped him, one of Brenner's orderlies. They brought him back to the laboratory, where Brenner waited beside the reanimated corpse. The surgeon's hands were shaking as he handed Harris a syringe. "If you are truly one of us," he said, "you will continue the work. Inject this into the next subject." Harris refused. The silence stretched like a noose. Brenner's smile vanished. "Then you are not a doctor," he whispered. "You are a witness." The following day, the camp erupted in chaos. The Germans were retreating. Fires consumed the archive rooms. Harris hid beneath a stairwell as soldiers smashed crates and poured acid over the files. Amid the confusion, Brenner carried a single box toward the trucks. Harris followed and saw inside the crate the bodies of 2 children. Twins preserved in formalin, their eyes still open. Attached to the lid was a tag, "Property of the Institute for Hereditary Biology, Berlin." Harris realized that the entire operation had been an export of atrocities, designed to continue beyond the fall of Auschwitz. When the power failed, the basement filled with darkness thicker than smoke. Harris used the flash of his camera to navigate the corridors. Each burst of light revealed fragments of hell, faces melted by acid, torsos stitched to machinery, lungs preserved in jars labeled voice. In one room, he found Marek Weiss, the orderly who had warned him weeks earlier. The man was alive but blind, his eyes burned out with chemicals. He reached for Harris's sleeve and whispered, "They are taking the souls. Do not let them leave with our faces." He died moments later, his hand still clutching Harris's coat. As the gunfire drew closer, Brenner made his final descent into Laboram 6. Harris followed him, driven by a mixture of fear and obsession. The surgeon was standing before the last functioning generator, feeding papers into its flames. "You can destroy the bodies," Brenner muttered, "but the idea remains. The body is a door, Dr. Harris. You Americans will open it again." His eyes were wet, not with remorse but revelation. In that instant, Harris saw that Brenner believed himself a savior of mankind, not its butcher. He lunged to stop him, but the generator exploded, hurling both men to the ground. When Harris awoke, the chamber was in ruins. The ceiling had collapsed. Brenner's body was pinned under steel, his face half burned yet still recognizable. He was alive, whispering something in German that Harris barely understood. Vergeben, den Körper nicht. Do not forgive the body. Then he died, smoke curling from his open mouth. Harris crawled through debris until he reached the surface. The camp was emptying into the woods, flames rising behind him. In his coat were the remaining pages of the ledger, the fragments of film, and the single vial labeled R29. The horror was not only in what he saw, but in what he carried. Every detail, every image, every smell clung to him like a second skin. In the days that followed, as he wandered among the ruins waiting for liberation, he wrote the final line of that chapter. Science was meant to heal the body. Here, it learned to dissect the soul. The spring of 1945 arrived like an illusion. The air over southern Poland softened, the snow receded into black mud, and the wind carried the faint smell of wet earth mixed with something older, ash, decay, and formalin. The Red Army crossed the ruins of Auschwitz with rifles lowered, expecting ghosts, finding only fragments. In a half-collapsed bunker behind the infirmary, they discovered Dr. Leonard Harris, barely conscious, covered in soot and dust, his notebook clutched against his chest. He did not speak for 3 days. When he finally opened his mouth, the first thing he asked was not for food, not for water, but for film developer. They treated him as a survivor, though he was not one of the prisoners. His uniform bore no insignia, his accent betrayed no origin. The Soviets questioned him in a dim, smoke-choked tent, where the walls leaked rain and the interpreter's voice trembled through the fog. Harris gave them names: Brenner, Vogel, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute. But the officers took notes without emotion. They had seen too many atrocities to differentiate one horror from another. When Harris mentioned the 29 procedures, they exchanged glances, then ended the interview. "Keep your records," one officer muttered. "Our truth will be written by victors." It was then that Harris understood the deeper silence. The world was not ready to listen. Weeks later, he was transferred to an Allied facility in Frankfurt, where intelligence officers debriefed him for 9 consecutive nights. They read through his notes with surgical detachment, marking passages in red. The photographs were catalogued, the vials sealed, the film stored in metal canisters labeled evidence classified. When Harris demanded that the material be sent to the United Nations War Crimes Tribunal, he was told that the experiments contained valuable medical data that could assist future research. In a single phrase, everything he had witnessed turned from crime into opportunity. The same language that had justified torture now justified secrecy. He began to deteriorate. His hands shook constantly. His eyes reacted to every flicker of light, as though expecting another flash of the camera. He tried to write reports, but his sentences collapsed into fevered fragments. In May 1946, he was reassigned to Washington under the pretext of medical intelligence cooperation. He spent his days in a locked office in the basement of the Naval Medical Research Center, rewriting his notes into sanitized summaries. The names of victims were replaced by initials. The descriptions of pain became reactions. The word torture was replaced by procedure. Each edit was another burial. One evening, an officer he barely knew, a young man with a clipped accent, handed him a memorandum-stamped project paperclip. It listed former Nazi doctors being recruited by the US government for scientific integration. Among the names, Harris saw it: Ernst Brenner, status, pending transfer. He stared at it for an hour, disbelieving. He had seen Brenner die beneath the wreckage, yet intelligence insisted he had been recovered near Munich and would soon be relocated to Fort Detrick under a new identity. Whether it was an error, a lie, or something worse, Harris could not tell. But that night he wrote in his personal diary, "The body may burn, but knowledge never dies. It only changes uniforms." By the 1950s, the world had forgotten Auschwitz as a living wound. The Cold War demanded new enemies, new horrors to fear. Harris withdrew from public life, teaching pathology at a small university in Massachusetts. His lectures were clinical, emotionless, yet his students noted how his hands always trembled when he spoke of the nervous system. He never mentioned the war. He married briefly, then divorced in silence. Every year he mailed a sealed envelope to himself from different cities, an old spy's habit. Inside each was a single undeveloped negative from his hidden archive. He feared that keeping them in one place would doom them to the same fate as the destroyed ledgers of Labor Arm 6. In 1962, during a faculty trip to Berlin, Harris visited what remained of the Institute for Hereditary Biology. The building was now a government office. He walked through its corridors with a stranger's calm, but in one storage room he recognized a smell, the faint sweetness of phenol, the same scent that clung to Brenner's gloves. On a shelf, half concealed under a pile of documents, lay a glass jar filled with preserved tissue. The label, faded but legible, read R29. His breath stopped. The same serum, the same mark. He asked the clerk about it, but the man shrugged. It was part of an old medical donation. Harris signed the visitor log under a false name and left without a word. That night, back in his hotel, he wrote his final recorded confession. "We did not inherit their crimes. We inherited their methods." The scalpel never forgets where it is cut. He died 3 years later of what the coroner called a cerebral event. Among his belongings, investigators found 47 rolls of undeveloped film, a broken Leica, and a small metal box sealed with wax. The box was sent to the National Archives, where it disappeared under the classification Restricted, Operation Stillwater. For decades, his story remained buried, neither myth nor memory, just a silence that grew thicker with each generation. Occasionally, a photograph surfaced in obscure academic journals, an arm wired with electrodes, a heart suspended in glass, a note scrawled in English and German reading, "Remember the door." No one connected them to Harris. His name faded from every report, replaced by bureaucratic titles. Observer 17 Civilian Asset. It was not until 1987 that a graduate student at Yale, researching Cold War medical ethics, stumbled upon a misfiled envelope containing one of Harris's negatives. When developed, it revealed a single haunting image: a man in a white coat standing beside a hospital bed, his face obscured by light, his gloved hand resting on the shoulder of a skeletal prisoner. On the table beside them, a sign written in German read, "Leben nach Tod," life after death. That image reignited the forgotten investigation. But by then, every trail had gone cold. The surviving doctors had died, their graves marked under false names. The archives remained sealed. And somewhere in the subterranean labyrinth of the US military's forgotten files, the remainder of Harris's work lay in permanent custody. His testimony reduced to numbers, his conscience preserved as data. Those who later examined his papers agreed on one thing: his handwriting changed toward the end. What began as neat, disciplined script devolved into trembling lines, as though the very act of remembering corroded the mind. His last fragment, found in the margins of a report, read, "Silence is not the absence of sound. It is the echo of everything we chose not to hear." The war had ended, but the silence it birthed never did. Time is the only true eraser of guilt, and yet in the case of Dr. Leonard Harris, even time refused to cooperate. Decades after the war, his story resurfaced like a wound that had never healed. The photographs once thought lost began to circulate among historians, journalists, and skeptics. Some dismissed them as fabrications, others recognized the grain, the exposure, the trembling composition, proof of a man photographing through tears. Each image carried the same impossible tension, the precision of medicine intertwined with the chaos of cruelty. They were not just photographs of bodies, they were X-rays of a century's conscience. Those who examined Harris's archives described the sensation of touching something radioactive, as if the paper itself emitted a residue of the suffering it recorded. The negatives were brittle, the ink faded, yet the content remained indestructible. A series of autopsy sketches labeled R29 Sustained Vital Reflex showed figures hovering between life and death, their expressions serene, almost peaceful. But the annotations betrayed the truth. Stimulus applied after cardiac arrest, minor convulsion at minute 3, visual focus detected at minute 5. Harris had captured the moment where science crossed into sacrilege, and no one could look at those pages without feeling complicit. By the 1990s, fragments of his work were declassified under public pressure. They appeared in brief reports, recovered medical intelligence from the Eastern Front, unverified anatomical studies, Operation Stillwater. But each document ended abruptly, redacted with thick black bars that obscured not only names, but entire truths. The final page of one file contained a handwritten note from an unknown archivist. Some doors were meant to stay closed. And yet, those doors continued to open. Modern researchers recognize disturbing similarities between Nazi procedures and certain Cold War medical projects conducted in both East and West. Harris's warnings, his pleas to destroy the data, had been ignored. The experiments on hypothermia, sensory deprivation, and nerve stimulation found new homes in laboratories across the world, justified by new ideologies. Only the language changed. Efficiency replaced purity, progress replaced order. Humanity, it seemed, had merely swapped uniforms. But among the sealed evidence, one photograph refused to vanish. It showed a glass tank filled with clear fluid, the outline of a human body suspended inside. Below it, a label in both English and German. Specimen recovered. January 1945, identity unknown. Some historians believed it was one of Brenner's test subjects. Others whispered that it might have been Harris himself, that his infiltration had gone deeper than anyone imagined, and the man who returned from Auschwitz was not entirely the same. What remains unquestionable is that his legacy never truly ended. Every few years, a journalist or filmmaker rediscovers a piece of his archive and resurrects the same haunting question. How far will mankind go when curiosity forgets compassion? The question echoes through universities, laboratories, and government vaults, always asked, never answered. Because to answer it would require confronting the fact that progress, even in its noblest form, is always built on bones. In 2003, a letter surfaced in the possession of a private collector. It was addressed to a Miss Abigail Harris, written in a trembling hand, unsigned but clearly his. The paper was dated March 1945, weeks before the liberation. The words were simple, almost tender. If they find this, tell them I was not a spy, not a hero. I only wanted to see what a human face looks like when it realizes God has left the room. After that, silence again. The silence of bureaucracy, the silence of archives, the silence that swallows uncomfortable truths. The same silence that once hung over the crematoria, now reborn in conference rooms and research grants. The kind of silence that does not deny, it merely forgets. And in that forgetting, it forgives. The modern world walks unknowingly upon the graves of Harris's witnesses. Hospitals use techniques derived from data gathered in camps. Universities quote statistics extracted from pain. We tell ourselves that the knowledge redeemed the crime, that the victims did not die in vain. But perhaps the real horror lies in the ease with which the human mind transforms memory into justification. Harris once wrote, "Evil does not hide in shadows. It hides in reports stamped confidential." This story, his story, is not simply about a man infiltrating a camp. It is about the thin membrane that separates civilization from monstrosity, intellect from obsession, healing from domination. The photographs he took are not relics of the past. They are mirrors of the present. Each one asks the same silent question. If the same opportunity were offered today, knowledge in exchange for conscience, would we refuse? And so, as the camera fades and the ashes settle, only one truth remains. The war may have ended in 1945, but its echo never did. It lives in every experiment that forgets empathy, in every discovery that erases the cost of its creation. Dr. Leonard Harris became a ghost not because he died, but because he remembered when everyone else chose to forget. This was the story of the American doctor who infiltrated a Nazi camp and recorded the 29 forgotten tortures. One story among thousands buried under silence and smoke. If you believe that history must not be rewritten by those who burned it, share this truth. Leave a comment. Subscribe to uncover the next forbidden chapter of our past before it disappears again into the dark.